The blood moon reigned high, casting its eerie crimson glow over the battlefield ruins. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth, charred steel, and the lingering ghost of death. Amidst the shattered stones and skeletal remains of a war long past, Lazarus Blackthorn moved like a shadow, silent, lethal, unchallenged. His presence was raw dominance, a force of nature wrapped in muscle and power, his every step an unspoken warning to the night itself. But then, he caught it, a scent unlike any other. Dark roses and frost-kissed silk, a whisper of danger, of secrets wrapped in the kind of beauty that could break a man. His pulse hammered in his veins, every instinct roaring that he should turn away. But the pull was stronger, irresistible. Fate was calling his name. Lazarus prowled forward, his golden eyes cutting through the veil of darkness, seeking the source of the intoxicating lure. And then he saw her, Seraphina Duskborn. A vision of pale fire draped in shadow, slumped against the crumbling archway of an abandoned chapel. Her midnight hair cascaded over her blood-stained gown, her skin a flawless shade of moonlight marred only by the dark gash at her ribs. Even wounded, even weakened, she was breathtaking, a creature forged from stardust and sin, made to tempt and torment. And she was watching him. Her gaze, a piercing silver laced with something untamed, locked onto his with an awareness that set his blood aflame. She did not cower, did not beg. Instead, her lips curved, soft, knowing, taunting. "Come to finish me, wolf." Her voice was silk over steel, each syllable curling like smoke in the air between them. Lazarus should have ended her. It was what he had been raised to do, what every law of his kind demanded. Vampires and werewolves were never meant to coexist. They were fire and ice, poison and blade. But nothing had ever felt more dangerously right than the sight of her, the taste of her name on his tongue. He stalked closer, the heat of his presence pressing into her like an unspoken vow. "Tell me, vampire," he murmured, voice dark and edged with something wicked. "Do you fear me?" Seraphina exhaled, slow and measured, the air between them growing taut as a blade's edge. Her fingers, delicate, deadly, drifted over the deep wound on her side, staining her ivory skin with crimson. She lifted those same fingers to her lips, and oh, the way she smiled, a secret, a promise, a challenge. "I fear nothing," she whispered. A lie, because she too felt it, the pull, the inevitability. Lazarus reached for her without thinking, without reason. His fingers ghosted over her wrist, his touch burning against her chilled skin. A single heartbeat stretched between them, an eternity trapped in the space of a breath. She did not pull away. His grip tightened, not cruel but possessive. "Then you should," he rumbled, his words more a warning to himself than to her. Seraphina's lips parted, something unreadable flickering behind her silver gaze. And then, with an exhale like a spell, she tilted her head ever so slightly, baring the smooth column of her throat. An invitation, a dare. The beast within Lazarus roared. He could taste the ruin she would bring, feel the war in his bones. But for the first time in his cursed existence, he didn't care, because Seraphina was no prey. She was his reckoning. The night stretched endless, cloaked in the hush of secrets too dangerous to speak. The wind whispered through the skeletal remains of the ruined chapel, stirring loose petals from the wild roses that had crept through the cracks of time. Beneath the blood moon's watchful gaze, Lazarus Blackthorn stood over Seraphina Duskborn, his presence a storm threatening to break. She should have fled the moment he approached, should have vanished into the night like the phantom she was. But instead, she lingered, as if drawn by something unseen, as if daring him to cross a line neither of them could ever return from. Lazarus was fire wrapped in flesh, all raw strength and unrelenting will, his golden eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that sent shivers down her spine. His kind were creatures of untamed hunger, ruled by the primal laws of the wild. But the way he looked at her, like she was both a sin and a salvation, made her feel like he was a creature bound by something far more dangerous. Himself. Seraphina tilted her head, the silver strands of her hair spilling over her shoulder, catching in the moonlight like liquid mercury. "You're hesitating, wolf," she murmured, her voice smooth as midnight silk. "Why?" Lazarus exhaled slowly, his jaw tight, his restraint coiled like a beast beneath his skin. He had seen beauty before, had hunted creatures more fearsome than she, yet none had ever called to him like this, like a whisper beneath his ribs, like the pull of something ancient and inevitable. "You know why?" he said, his voice low, edged with a warning that was meant for himself. She stepped closer, too close. Close enough that the frost of her presence clashed against the heat of his, a war fought in the space between them. "You think I'm fragile?" she challenged, silver eyes glinting with something sharp. Lazarus let out a dark chuckle, the sound rolling through the quiet ruins like distant thunder. "No," he admitted, his gaze tracing the delicate arch of her throat, the way her pulse, slow, deliberate, beat just beneath porcelain skin. "I think you're deadly." Serafina smiled then, slow and knowing. "And yet, here you stand." A challenge, a lure wrapped in a whisper. Lazarus was no fool. He had spent his life fighting against his own nature, against the monster that lurked beneath his skin. But this was different. This was something neither claws nor fangs could fight. A hunger of a different kind. His fingers moved before he could stop them, brushing against the soft fabric at her waist, feeling the sharp contrast of warmth against cold. She did not flinch, did not move away. Instead, she tilted her chin, daring him to go further. "You should run from me," he murmured, his voice rough, barely controlled. Serafina's lips parted, a whisper of a smile dancing there. "I never run." The space between them vanished. Lazarus's grip tightened, his breath warm against her temple, his presence drowning her in a way that should have terrified her, but didn't. She was not prey. And he was not just a hunter. They were something else. Something forbidden. Something doomed. But in that moment, as the wind carried the scent of roses and rain, as his golden eyes burned into hers with a promise of war and ruin, neither of them cared. Because for the first time, the monster and the moonlit phantom stood not as enemies, but as something far more dangerous. The night held its breath. The ruined chapel, bathed in the eerie glow of the blood moon, stood as a silent witness to the impossible moment unfolding within its shadows. Lazarus Blackthorn stood before Serafina Dustborn, a storm wrapped in flesh, his golden eyes burning with a hunger that went far beyond instinct. The air between them pulsed, charged with an invisible force neither could name, neither could deny. Serafina had been raised in darkness, taught that wolves were nothing more than beasts to be hunted, their kind forever at war with hers. And yet she had never felt danger like this before. Not the kind that came with fangs and claws, but the kind that stole breath, that threatened to pull her into something deeper than the abyss itself. "You're too close," she murmured, though she made no move to stop him. Lazarus let out a quiet, dark chuckle. "You're the one who stepped forward first," he reminded her, his voice low, rough, dangerously steady. His fingers ghosted along the edge of her sleeve, the briefest touch, and yet it sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the cold. Serafina tilted her chin, silver eyes gleaming beneath the moonlight. "Do you fear what this is, wolf?" A muscle in his jaw twitched, as if he was restraining himself from something he did not yet name. "Fear," he echoed, the word almost a growl. His gaze dropped to the curve of her throat, where her pulse, slow, taunting, knowing, betrayed her. "No," he said, stepping closer, until the heat of him wrapped around her, caging her without a single touch. "But you should," he finished. Serafina did not move away, did not cower. Instead, she smiled, slow, knowing, lethal. She reached up, her touch feather light as she traced the line of his collar, feeling the way his muscles tensed beneath her fingertips. He was strength wrapped in a storm, a creature made of raw instinct and wild fury. But with her, he was something else. "Do you think I am afraid of you, Lazarus?" she whispered, her voice nothing more than a breath between them. His fingers curled against his palms, his control hanging by a thread. He should have left her there in the ruins, should have turned his back and disappeared into the forest before this went too far. But it was already too late. Lazarus lifted a hand, catching her wrist in his grasp, his touch firm, burning, possessive. "I think," he said slowly, deliberately, "you are playing with something neither of us can control." Seraphina's smile deepened. Good, she whispered. I like danger. Something inside Lazarus snapped. His grip tightened, not cruel, but unyielding as he pulled her closer, until there was nothing between them but air and the unspoken war raging in their veins. His breath was warm against her cheek, his voice nothing more than a dark promise. You have no idea what real danger feels like, little vampire. Her lips parted, her silver eyes flickering with something unreadable. Then show me, she dared. A heartbeat passed. Then another. And in that fragile, forbidden moment, the hunter and the hunted became something else entirely. The night whispered with secrets, the wind weaving between the broken chapel walls like a ghost searching for something lost. The scent of rain and wild roses clung to the ruins, mingling with something darker, the unspoken hunger between a wolf and a vampire who should have been enemies, yet stood as something far more dangerous. Lazarus Blackthorn could feel it in his bones, the pull, the slow unraveling of the law he had lived by, the instinct that had ruled him. It should have been simple: kill her, walk away, forget this ever happened. But nothing about Seraphina Duskborn was simple. She stood before him, all cold fire and forbidden elegance, her silver eyes watching him with the patience of something immortal. She did not tremble, did not waver, but he could hear her breath, steady, measured, aware. She was waiting, not to run, not to fight, but for him. The realization struck him like a bolt of lightning. I should leave, he murmured, his voice rough, betraying the war in his chest. Seraphina's lips curved, soft and knowing. But you won't. No, he wouldn't. Lazarus reached for her before reason could stop him. His fingers brushed against the silk of her sleeve, trailing down until they found her wrist. Cold against heat, shadow against flame. The contrast should have burned. Instead, it made him crave more. Seraphina tilted her head, exposing the smooth line of her throat, a silent challenge wrapped in delicate temptation. Does it unsettle you, she whispered, that I do not fear you? Lazarus exhaled, slow and dangerous. It should. Her smile deepened, her silver eyes flickering with something unreadable. Perhaps I like the idea of being caught. The words sent a firestorm through him, a rush of something raw, something he had never allowed himself to feel. His grip tightened, not enough to harm, but enough to remind them both of what he was, what she was, and the ruin they were walking into. You're playing with fire, vampire, he warned, his voice dark as the sky above them. Seraphina leaned in, the scent of midnight roses curling around him like a spell. And you, she whispered, are holding the match. A slow breath, a moment too long. Then Lazarus moved. Not a decision, not a thought, pure instinct. His hand traced up, fingers brushing the curve of her jaw, his touch firm, possessive. Seraphina did not pull away. She leaned into it, as if she had been waiting for this, as if she had known from the very moment their eyes had met beneath the moon. The space between them vanished. His breath warmed her skin, the air thick with a tension that neither of them could deny. A battle fought without swords, without claws. Just the unspoken war of a beast drawn to something he should never have wanted. Seraphina's voice was barely a whisper. Tell me, Lazarus, what will you do now? His grip tightened, his jaw clenched, his world crumbling around him. And yet when he spoke, his voice was nothing but a promise. Whatever it takes, he murmured, to make you mine. The night grew heavier, thick with the weight of something unspoken. The blood moon, high above the ruins, bathed them in a crimson glow, as if the heavens themselves watched with bated breath. Lazarus Blackthorn stood still, every muscle taut, every breath measured. The wolf in him wanted to claim, to conquer, to mark her as his. But the man, the part of him that still clung to reason, knew that taking one more step meant falling into something from which neither of them would ever return. Seraphina Duskborn stood before him, pale fire in the dark, her silver eyes locked onto his like an enchantment he had no hope of breaking. There was no fear in her, only a knowing silence, as if she had already decided how this would end. Lazarus reached for her, unable to stop himself. His fingers traced the edge of her sleeve, then lower, along the cool, silken skin of her wrist. The contrast sent a thrill through him, Heat against ice, power against poise, something primal pressing against something eternal. You shouldn't be here, he murmured, his voice rough, like stones scraping against one another. Seraphina's lips curved, a slow, deliberate thing. And yet, here I am. The space between them burned. His grip tightened, not enough to hurt, but enough to hold her still. You're playing a dangerous game, vampire. She lifted her chin, her midnight hair spilling over her shoulders like woven shadows. So are you, she whispered, silver eyes gleaming in the dark. And you love it. A growl rumbled low in his throat, his self-control hanging by a thread. She was right. The scent of her, dark roses, cold rain, something forbidden wrapped around him like a spell. His body knew what it wanted, what it craved. But this was no ordinary desire. It was deeper, sharper, more consuming. Seraphina moved, closing the last sliver of space between them. Her fingers, delicate, dangerous, pressed lightly against his chest, feeling the wild thunder of his heart beneath the fabric. You're holding back, she murmured, tilting her head ever so slightly, exposing the soft curve of her throat. A silent challenge, a taunt. Lazarus inhaled sharply. His hands found her waist, firm, unrelenting. You don't know what you're asking for, he warned, his voice low, dark with something unspoken. Seraphina only smiled, because she did. And she knew, deep in her immortal bones, that there was no turning back now. Lazarus moved then, swift, powerful, inevitable, pulling her against him, his presence wrapping around her like the wild storm he was. The heat of him, the raw, uncontained force barely restrained beneath his skin, sent a shiver through her, not of fear, but of something far more dangerous. She gasped softly, but it was not in protest. His breath was warm against her temple, his fingers pressing against the silk of her gown, feeling the shape of her beneath it. You are mine, he growled, his words a vow, a warning, a surrender. Seraphina's silver eyes flickered with something dark, something wicked. Then prove it, she whispered. And with that, the night swallowed them whole. The night air trembled with something unseen, something ancient. The ruined chapel stood as a silent witness to what should never have been. A werewolf and a vampire, entangled in something darker than fate itself. Lazarus Blackthorn had never known restraint to be so torturous. His kind did not hesitate, did not linger. They took what they wanted, left no room for doubt. And yet, standing here, feeling Seraphina Duskborn's cold fire pressing against his heat, he was undone. She was still, watching him with those silver eyes, her lips parted just enough to let the breath of a whisper slip through. Her touch, delicate and deliberate, traced the strong lines of his jaw, the warmth of his skin an intoxicating contrast against her own. You feel it too, she murmured. Lazarus's grip tightened at her waist, his fingers pressing into silk and ice. I do, he admitted, voice rough, edged with something unspoken. And I hate it. A slow smile ghosted over Seraphina's lips, as if she already knew this war he waged within himself. Liar, she whispered, her tone laced with dark amusement. You don't hate it, you fear it. Lazarus let out a low growl, his golden eyes flashing with a hunger that had nothing to do with the beast inside him. I fear nothing, he said, his voice a dark promise. Seraphina only tilted her head, her silver hair catching in the moonlight. Then why are you still holding back? The challenge ignited something inside him, something raw, something dangerous. With a swift, commanding motion, he pulled her closer, his presence swallowing hers like fire-consuming air. His breath fanned against her cheek, his scent of wild earth and storm wrapping around her like an unbreakable tether. She should have pulled away, should have run. But she didn't. Instead, she pressed closer, her cool fingertips trailing down the ridges of his chest, feeling the weight his pulse thundered beneath her touch. I thought wolves took what they wanted, she whispered. Lazarus let out a dark chuckle, but there was no humor in it, only the sharp edge of control slipping from his grasp. You are playing a dangerous game, vampire. Seraphina's lips barely moved as she breathed. Then let me lose. His patience shattered. With a swift, powerful motion, he backed her against the ancient stone wall of the chapel, his body caging hers, his will the only thing keeping him from ruin. His golden eyes burned into hers, searching, warning, claiming. Seraphina inhaled sharply, but it was not fear. It was anticipation, a wicked kind of invitation only she could give. Her lips parted, her silver eyes darkening as her fingers curled against his chest. Mine, Lazarus growled, the word rough, possessive, undeniable. Seraphina let out a soft, knowing laugh. Then prove it, wolf. The air between them crackled. A moment held on the edge of oblivion. And then, under the watchful gaze of the blood moon, the beast and the huntress gave in. The night stretched long and endless, the world beyond the ruined chapel fading into nothingness. Only they remained, a beast of the wild and a queen of the dark, bound by something neither could name, neither could resist. Lazarus Blackthorn had lost himself in her, in the scent of midnight roses, in the ice fire of her touch, in the way her silver eyes held his like a whispered spell meant only for him. He had spent a lifetime fighting against instinct, against the pull of the wild, but Seraphina Dustborn was not something he could fight. She was inevitable. She stood before him, a creature of shadow and moonlight, her breath slow, steady, expectant. The ruined stone at her back was cold, but her body, her presence, was anything but. "You hesitate," she murmured, her voice like silk slipping through the darkness. "Why?" Lazarus exhaled, his hands still framing her waist, his fingers pressing against the delicate fabric that separated them. She was smaller than him, fragile in ways he did not trust, yet she had never looked more powerful, more dangerous. His grip tightened. "Because I know what happens next." Seraphina's lips curled, slow and wicked. "Do you?" A challenge. A dare. Lazarus let out a low, rough sound, his restraint fraying like threads pulled too tight. He had fought battles, torn through enemies without mercy, but this was the war he could never win. Seraphina moved first, her cold fingers trailing up the hard planes of his chest, her touch feather-light, teasing. "I think," she whispered, "you like losing to me." Lazarus caught her wrist, his grip firm, possessive. He dragged it back down, pressing her palm against his racing heart. "Make no mistake," he murmured, his voice dark, low. "I do not lose." Seraphina's silver gaze burned into him, something knowing, something wicked. "Then take what is already yours." The words shattered the last of his restraint. Lazarus moved, swift, unrelenting, caging her fully between himself and the stone. His breath was warm against her temple, his presence an unspoken vow. No more hesitation, no more denying what had always been inevitable. Seraphina's breath hitched, not in fear, but in surrender. "You should be afraid of me," Lazarus growled, his voice rough, edged with something primal. Seraphina only smiled, tilting her head ever so slightly, the invitation unmistakable. "And yet," she whispered, "I am not." The night swallowed them whole. The night air was thick with something unseen, something claimed, unshaken, eternal. The ruined chapel had become their sanctuary, its broken walls holding the echoes of a bond that should never have existed. A werewolf and a vampire, bound by desire, shackled by fate. Lazarus Blackthorn stood in the moon's crimson glow, his golden eyes dark with something more than hunger. The fire that had always burned inside him had found its match in her. Seraphina Dustborn, a creature of cold beauty, deadly grace. And yet she was not untouchable, not anymore. She stood before him, her silver eyes shimmering like molten mercury, her breath steady despite the storm between them. The delicate fabric of her gown whispered against his skin as he closed the space between them, his presence an unspoken claim, a promise he would never break. Seraphina tilted her head, her midnight hair spilling over her shoulders like woven shadows. "You look at me like I am something to be devoured," she murmured, amusement curling at the edges of her lips. Lazarus's hand traced the curve of her waist, slow, deliberate. "That's because you are." Her soft laugh sent something wicked through him, something untamed. "And yet, here I stand, untouched." His grip tightened, his jaw clenching. "Not for long." Seraphina inhaled, her cool fingers trailing up the strong column of his throat, feeling the pulse that thundered beneath her touch. "Then what are you waiting for, wolf?" Lazarus moved before she could finish, his hand sliding to the small of her back, pulling her against him with a force that left no room for doubt. She did not resist. She never would. "You should fear me," he rasped against her skin, his breath warm, teasing, dangerous. Seraphina's lips curled, her silver gaze sharp, knowing. "And yet, I do not." A growl rumbled low in his chest, vibrating through them both. She was his undoing, his ruin, and he would never escape her. Seraphina let out a breathless whisper, her cool hands pressing against the hard lines of his chest. "Say it," she murmured, her voice softer than moonlight. Lazarus exhaled slowly, his grip unrelenting. His next words were not a confession, they were a vow. "You are mine." Seraphina smiled, slow, wicked, victorious. "Then prove it," she whispered. And as the blood moon cast its final glow upon them, they fell into the dark, together.